Welcome students, welcome to lecture number 34 where we will be starting with module number 5 under subject financial management. So module number 5 is nothing but working capital management, which is divided into two parts. One is the theory part of working capital, where we will be seeing what is the meaning of working capital, what are the factors influencing working capital requirements, what is current asset policy and what is current asset finance policy. Apart from that, we will be seeing determination and estimation of operating cycle, cash cycle, estimation of working capital requirements of the firm, case study on working capital determination. So this, what you can see on the right hand side, is a combination of theory as well as problems. But on the left hand side, it is a complete theory part. So today, students, we will be covering this theory part. That is, what is the meaning of working capital, factors influencing working capital requirements, current asset policy, and current asset finance policy. So we will be, in today's lecture, we will be covering the left-hand side. So let us first understand what is the meaning of working capital. It represents the funds available to the enterprise to finance regular operations, that is, day-to-day business activities effectively. So students, working capital is nothing but capital. Capital is nothing but your funds, which is required for the day-to-day working of the organization. Okay. So whatever capital is needed by the firm to finance its current assets. Okay. Like it has to finance its current assets. So whatever funds are needed, it is called as working capital. So in short, it is nothing, it represents whatever funds, okay, are available to the company or enterprise to, run its day-to-day operations, so that it has enough liquidity so that it can pay for its pay its current liabilities, and it can finance its current assets. So the formula for working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. Now, what is current assets? Current assets represents those assets which can be easily transformed into cash within 1 year. So again, it is short term. That is, whatever assets can be easily transformed into cash within 1 year, like your bills receivable, debtors. Usually, you have a credit period of only three months. Whenever you go to a shop, you buy any goods on credit, they give you a credit period of only 3 months. So that becomes your current assets. So it is very for a short period of time, that is for a period of 1 year. On the other hand, current liabilities refers to those obligations which are paid within an accounting year. So both current assets as well as current liabilities are short term, okay, and whatever excess amount is remaining, okay, from your current assets, when you pay off all your current liabilities, whatever excess over and above is remaining, that becomes your working capital. So working capital is very helpful, in order to provide the liquidity of the company. Okay, that is how efficiently the company is able to cover the short term debts with its short term assets. See students, we know current liabilities is short term obligations, that is short term payments like bills payable, creditors, if you have taken a short term loan for a period of 1 year, or these are current liabilities. Within a period of 1 year, we have to pay them off. We have current assets. Current assets also are which can be converted into cash within a period of 1 year, like we have stock, we have cash in hand, cash at bank. These all are our current assets. So working capital, in short, will show you how efficiently a company will be able to meet its current liabilities with its current assets. So in short, working capital is nothing but capital required for the day-to-day working of the organization. So in short, it is a short-term capital. If you see, it is not for a long-term period. For day-to-day running operations of the business, you require money, you require finance. That finance is nothing but the working capital that you require. Next, you have types of working capital. So working capital is basically divided into two types, that is value based and time based. So now under value based working capital, you have gross working capital and net working capital. Now what is gross working capital? Students, as I have told you that working capital is nothing but it is going to show you the liquidity position of the company, that how quickly the company can sell its current assets or convert its current assets into cash and pay off its current liabilities, right? So when I say gross working capital, it means the overall company's overall investment in the current assets. So gross means before making the payment of current liabilities, whatever amount is there with the company, that is the current assets with the company, that represents your gross working capital. So gross working capital is before making the payment to the current liabilities, whatever the company is investing in the current assets, that represents the gross working capital. Next is your net working capital. So here it implies the surplus. You see, we know what is the formula for working capital. It is current asset minus current liabilities. So working capital is a surplus of current assets over current liabilities, right? So net working capital implies that surplus of current assets over current liabilities. So suppose if you get current assets minus current liabilities, you get a positive answer. So positive net working capital will represent or show that the company is having the ability to meet its short-term liabilities. Whereas suppose if it is a negative net working capital, it will show the company's inability to fulfill the short-term obligations. See, just remember current assets is nothing but your cash, because you are going to convert your current assets into cash within a period of 1 year. Okay, and current liabilities is all your obligations that you have to pay to the outsiders. Now, if current asset minus current liability, you get a positive answer. That means the company is very efficient enough to pay off its liabilities. Suppose if the net working capital, you get a negative answer. That means the company is unable to pay off its current liabilities or short-term obligations. So once again, I repeat, working capital is divided by into value-based and time-based. Value-based gross working capital represents the company's investment in the current assets, and net working capital is the surplus of current assets over current liabilities. Next is time-based. In time-based, you have is two types, that is temporary or variable working capital and permanent or fixed working capital. That means it like variable working capital, you can also call it as temporary working capital. Now what is this temporary working capital? It is a portion of that capital, students, which is needed by the firm along with the permanent working capital to fulfill short-term working capital needs that emerge out of fluctuation of the sales volume. What happens when your sales is getting fluctuated? Your permanent working capital is fixed. You require that much amount to run your business. Okay, or to carry permanent is you require a fixed amount of working capital to run your day-to-day operations without any interruptions, without any distraction, without any interruptions. If you want your operations to run smoothly, that is called as permanent working capital. And temporary working capital is a portion of that capital, okay, which you require along with your permanent working capital, because if there is some fluctuation in the same sales volume, you have this temporary working capital or variable working capital with you. So this working capital will emerge out of fluctuation in the sales volume. We never know when an enterprise, the sales can, be higher in a month, lower in the next month. Okay, it is not same in all the months. So whenever there is a fluctuation, obviously the cash for each month also will be changing. It will not be the same. So this temporary working capital will come out because of the sales fluctuation. Okay, and permanent working capital is that minimum amount which the company holds, which the company is going to keep it with it to run its operation without any distraction or interruption. So this is called as permanent working capital. So based on time, you have temporary and permanent. Based on value, you have gross and net working capital. Is this clear? What is the meaning of working capital and types of working capital? Is this two part clear to everyone? Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Next, let us see what are the factors influencing working capital requirements. Okay. So the factors influencing working capital requirements are nature of business, okay, scale of operation, business cycle, seasonal factor, production cycle, credit allowed, credit availed, operating efficiency, availability of raw materials, growth prospects, level of competition, and inflation. So all these factors play a very important role in influencing what is the working capital to be required by the firm. So let us just, in short, I'll just explain this. Nature of business. See students, the nature of business we know is can be of two types. Either the business can be a manufacturing business or it can be a trading business. Now, if it is a manufacturing business, it will take lot of time for the business to convert its current assets, that is converting its raw material into finished goods. Are you understanding? What happens in manufacturing business? You bring the raw materials, you convert it into finished goods, and then you sell it. And then you will get the cash. But in trading business, you already have ready material available, you have to just sell it. So depending on the nature of business, the working capital requirement also changes. So as I told you, in case of manufacturing business, it will take lot of time to convert the raw material into finished goods. Therefore, what happens in such a business? The capital will remain invested in the raw material for a longer period of time because that amount is not getting easily converted into cash. Correct. Similarly, in trading business, what happens? The goods are sold immediately. Okay. After you have to just purchase the goods and sell it. So the goods are sold immediately and the sales is affected, like the sales takes place. Therefore, very little working capital is required because your stock is easily getting converted into cash. Okay, so depending on the nature of business also, this is a very important factor which influences your working capital requirement. Next is scale of operation. Now students, there is a direct link between the working capital and scale of operation. See, in other words, let me tell you that more working capital is required in case of big organization, while less working capital is needed in case of small organization. See, depending upon your scale of operation, depending upon your volume of business, depending how big the organization is, your working capital will change. We cannot say that suppose a Reliance company and one store in Belgaum both have the same working capital requirements. No, depending on your volume of business, your working capital will change from business to business. So if you're a big organization, you'll require more working capital. If there is a small organization, it will require a less working capital. Next, business cycle. So business cycle, as we know, see students, we know that working capital is affected in every stage of business cycle. Okay, so what happens during the if for a business it is a boom period, the demand of the product will increase. Okay, this with the demand of the product increasing, the sales also will increase. Therefore, more working capital is required. On the contrary, if the period where it is not a boom period for the business, that is if there is a depression period for the business, suppose if the demand is going down, the sales also will be affected, the production also will be affected. Therefore, in such situation, less working capital is required. So business cycle means, see, for every business, it is not that the entire year the business will be very good. For some seasonal businesses, or you can say for some business houses, the business will run for 4 months, and for the remaining months the business will be very down. So when the business is very down, less working capital is required. When the business is booming, more working capital is required. Next is seasonal factor. So as we know, some goods are demanded throughout the year with weather. Okay, some goods are demanded throughout the year, whereas there are some goods which are demanded only during certain seasons. So goods which are have uniform demand throughout the year, their production will be uniform throughout the year, their sales will be uniform throughout the year. Okay, and they will need very less working capital. On the other hand, okay, if there is a seasonal demand for a product, okay, so what happens in seasonal demand for a product? They will require more working capital, because what happens, such whatever, suppose if they are goods they have purchased, suppose seasonal factors, suppose you take umbrellas, the shopkeepers who are doing business of umbrellas, or this sweaters and all that. So what happens, their sales will be affected only during winter seasons or during rainy seasons. So what happens, their stock is not easily converted into cash, because sales is not happening during non-seasonal days. Okay, during non-seasonal months where there is summer season, so that time their sales will obviously not happen, so they will require more working capital. Next, production cycle. So production cycle means whatever time is involved in converting the raw material into finished goods. The longer the production cycle will be, the more time of the capital will be blocked in the raw materials and semi manufactured products. What happens, students, in production cycle? Suppose if the cycle is too very long, it is taking lots of time to convert the raw material into finished goods, then your capital is invested in that raw material, which is blocking it. So here what happens is the working capital is being blocked. So in such case, more working capital will be required. On the other hand, if the period of production cycle is very little, then the working capital needed also will be less. Next is credit allowed. See, students, credit allowed means those enterprises who are selling the goods on cash payment basis need very little working capital. Okay, but those who are providing credit facilities to the customers need more working capital, because obvious it is, if you're selling the goods on cash, you're immediately getting the cash. Okay, so there is no requirement of working capital, more working capital. But suppose you're selling the goods on credit, so your requirement of working capital increases, since you have not easily converted your stock into cash. Next is credit avail. So if the what happens if the raw materials are easily available on credit? Suppose availed means you are receiving it. Okay, so suppose you are purchasing raw materials on credit, then you require less working capital. But on the same hand, if the raw materials what you're purchasing, or the stock or the purchases that you're making is not available on credit, okay, you have to make cash payment, then larger amount of working capital is required. Next, operating efficiency. Now, operating efficiency means how effectively the business operations have to be completed. Okay, how efficient the business is to carry on its operations. So as we know, operating efficiency of every organization will be different. It will not be the same. So for some example, you can take converting raw materials into finished. Some organization may convert the raw materials to finished goods at the earliest, or some organization may sell the finished goods quickly. Okay, or some organization may get the payments from the debtors quickly. So the company which has better operating efficiency, okay, has to invest less in their stock and debtors. Obviously, if a company is operating very efficiently, okay, it will require less working capital. On the other hand, if the companies are not working that efficiently, they will require more working capital. Availability of raw materials. So the availability of raw material also is a factor that influences the amount of working capital. Suppose if the enterprise makes use of raw material which is available easily throughout the year, then less working capital will be required. Okay, because there is no need to stock up the raw material, as the company knows that it will be easily available, so it will not stock up the raw material, it will purchase as and when it requires, so less working capital is required. On the other hand, suppose if the raw material is available only during particular months, okay, or there is a shortage of raw material, so what the company will do, the company will stock up those raw materials, okay, and in such case the amount of working capital required will be high. Next is growth prospects. So in short, growth prospects is nothing, students, but how the scale of business operation will develop, like how a company is able to develop its scale of operations. When I say scale of operations, it can be the production, in the line of production, in the line of sales. Okay. So the organization which is having sufficient possibilities of growth, like the organization wants that it is targeting towards its growth, okay, will require more working capital. While on the other hand, we see that suppose those organization which are not focusing on their growth, or which is having less growth prospects, the working capital requirement will be lower. Next, level of competition. So very simple, high level of competition means there is a need for more working capital, okay, and if the competition is less working capital is required. Now why in case of high level, if the competition is high, why is more working capital required? Because in order for the companies to face the competition, more stock is required for quick delivery and credit facility for a longer period, okay, it has to be made available. Now if you are into the competition, okay, what happens, you have to make sure you have surplus stock, you have to make sure that if the stock is being sold to the customer, it has to be quickly delivered. So all these things, if the level of competition is high, more working capital will be required. Next is inflation. Inflation is also one of the factors that influence the working capital requirement, and inflation means, as you know, is nothing but the rise in the prices. So obviously, when there is an inflation in the country, what happens? More capital is required than before in order to maintain the previous scale of production and your sales. Suppose in this year there is no inflation, so you have a particular limit of your production and sales. In the next year, if there is inflation, you will require more working capital, okay, to meet up the previous production and sale at least. Okay, so therefore, whatever the rate of inflation, whatever rate the inflation is increasing, okay, there will be a corresponding increase in the working capital also. So higher the inflation, higher the requirement of working capital. So all these are factors influencing working capital requirements. In short, it means that working capital requirement will change from business to business, enterprise to enterprise, and depending on all these factors, the working capital requirement will change from organization to organization. Is this clear, students? Is the factors influencing working capital requirement, is this clear to everyone? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Next, let us understand current asset and current asset finance policy. This is the last part that we are going to see. Now, what is current asset policy, students? Assets of the company are financed by raising long-term and short-term funds through various sources. This we have already seen, students. How does a company procure any asset? It requires finance. How is this finance coming to a company? Either through short-term sources of finance or long-term sources of finance. So the ratio of long-term and short-term sources of financing a company's current asset is determined by various factors. See, the company has to prepare a policy. Okay, policy means it has to document that okay, how my current assets are going to be financed. See, every company will establish a level of current asset. Like obviously, a company wants surplus net working capital. It will not want that it should not pay the obligations. So the obviously a company wants the current assets to be more than the current liabilities, so it has a surplus, correct? So it has to first establish the amount of current assets that is required. Then it will determine by the policy that what mix of long term and short term debt should be employed by the company in order to support the current assets. See, again, I'm repeating, current asset policy is nothing but a document that is made by a company or a policy that is made by a company where it will decide what should be the combination of long term and short term funds in such a way that it finances the current assets and the current assets are sufficient enough to pay off the current liabilities. So, this is nothing but current asset policy. So, policy has to be prepared. A company has to first determine the level of current assets required, then it has to determine what is the mix, that is proportion or ratio of short term and long term funds required to invest in the current assets, and then it has to make sure that the current assets are more than the current liabilities so that the company can smoothly pay off all the obligations and can have surplus working capital with it. Next is current asset finance policy. So there are three current assets financing strategies, okay, which you can see here. Is first is the hedging matching policy, next is a conservative policy, third is the aggressive policy. Now let us see what is each of the policy states. First is hedging matching policy. So what happens in this policy? So this is basically a strategy, okay, which finances the permanent current assets and fixed assets with long-term sources and temporary current assets with short-term sources. See, students, I told you what is current asset policy. Here you have to determine the level of current assets first. Second, you have to determine the mix. What is a combination of short-term and long-term funds that you're going to invest in the current assets. Now, in that hedging matching policy, in this strategy, what happens is your permanent current assets and your fixed assets will be financed by your long-term sources of finance, and your temporary current assets will be financed by your short-term sources of finance. So, in hedging matching policy, how is the finance done? How are you going to take the mix or combination of long-term and short-term? Long-term sources you're going to use for permanent current assets and fixed assets, and short-term sources you're going to use for current assets, temporary current assets. Next is conservative policy. Now what happens in this conservative policy? How the mix is decided? In this strategy, what happens? Only a portion of temporary current assets are financed with the short-term sources, and the long-term financing is used to fund the other portion of temporary current assets along with permanent current assets and fixed assets. So in conservative policy, what happens, students? Again, I'm repeating, your long-term sources will fund what? Your fixed assets and permanent current assets, and your remaining portion of your temporary current assets. So here in conservative policy, your entire short-term sources of finance will not finance the you not finance the temporary current assets. Only a portion of temporary current assets will be financed by short-term sources. Rest all the other investments in fixed assets, temporary current assets, remaining portion of the temporary current assets, it will be financed by the long-term sources of finance. Next is aggressive policy. So what happens in aggressive policy? Under this strategy, a company will finance a portion of permanent current assets and all the temporary current assets with short-term sources. So here what happens is your permanent and your temporary current assets both are financed by the short-term sources of finance, and the long-term financing is used to fund the other portion of permanent current assets and fixed assets. So in aggressive is totally opposite of conservative. In aggressive, what happens, students? Your temporary current assets and your portion of permanent current assets is financed by short term, and that remaining portion of permanent current assets and your fixed assets is financed by the long term sources of financing. Is this clear, students? Yes, students? Students, is this current asset and current asset finance policy clear to everyone?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So thank you so much, students. We are